So there are three types of muscle. There's skeletal muscle, there's cardiac muscle, and there's smooth muscle. But in this video, I want to focus on skeletal muscle. So there are two types of skeletal muscle. There's type 1 slow twitch fibers, and there's type 2 fast twitch fibers. And in reality, it's a little more complex, but for simplicity, let's say there's two types, type 1 and type 2. So what's the difference between type 1 skeletal muscle and type 2 skeletal muscle? Well, the fundamental difference is that type 1 skeletal muscle requires oxidative phosphorylation to create the ATP for contraction, while type 2 skeletal muscle uses glycolysis to create the ATP necessary for contraction. So type 1 skeletal muscle is optimized to do oxidative phosphorylation. So how is type 1 skeletal muscle optimized to do oxidative phosphorylation? Well, first of all, it has a very large capillary density. There's a lot of capillary per unit volume in these type 1 skeletal muscle. And not just that, the geometry of these skeletal muscles allow it so there's a lot of surface area per unit volume. So this is optimized to have a lot of exposure to oxygen, because if there's a lot of capillaries and a lot of surface area to make contact with those capillaries, there can be a lot of diffusion of oxygen, because we know we breathe, and then that brings oxygen in our blood, and then that oxygen in our blood can enter skeletal muscle. So therefore, we have a large capillary density, and we have a lot of surface area per volume that optimizes the contact between the skeletal muscle and the capillaries. So therefore, there's an abundance of oxygen. And not just that, these type 1 skeletal muscle has a lot of myoglobin. There's a lot of myoglobin that binds on and stores oxygen. So, and these myoglobin molecules, due to the way that they interact with iron, have a red color. So these type 1 skeletal muscles are sometimes seen as red. But again, we can see, based on these circumstances, there's a ton of oxygen in these type 1 skeletal muscles. There's a lot of capillary density, which provides the oxygen. There's a lot of surface area per volume, so that provides a lot of contact, allowing oxygen to diffuse. And there's myoglobin that's storing oxygen. So there's extra oxygen that can be released. But not just that, these type 1 skeletal muscles also have a large mitochondria density. There's a lot of mitochondria per unit volume. So these type 1 skeletal muscles are rich in mitochondria. So now we can see how we're optimized to do oxidative phosphorylation. We have a lot of oxygen due to these reasons we explained before, and we have a lot of mitochondria. So if we have a lot of oxygen and a lot of mitochondria, now we know we can do a lot of oxidative phosphorylation. So we can see how type 1 skeletal muscles have evolved and are optimized to do this oxidative phosphorylation. Because again, remember, oxidative phosphorylation occurs in the mitochondria when we have excess oxygen. So what about these type 2 skeletal muscle? We know these type 2 skeletal muscles rely on glycolysis to create their ATP. So how does that work? Well, first of all, these type 2 skeletal muscles have very low capillary density. So there's not a lot of capillaries here. They also have a very small surface area to volume ratio. So there's relatively more volume and relatively less surface area. And there's also very low myoglobin. So due to all these factors, we can see that there's probably fairly low oxygen levels. There's very low capillaries, so therefore there's very little oxygen diffusing from those capillaries. There's very little contact with capillaries due to the geometry of the skeletal muscle. And again, just due to all this volume, these oxygen molecules couldn't even diffuse very well to the center. So the point is these type 2 skeletal muscles have very low oxygen. And also they have very low mitochondria density. So now we can see these type 2 skeletal muscles have a very low capacity for oxidative phosphorylation. There's very few mitochondria and there's very little access to oxygen. So you might wonder, why would this evolve? What is the utility of having such poor oxidative phosphorylation? Why would we evolve this in the first place? Well, these type 2 skeletal muscles have a ton of glycogen. And we know we can take these glycogen stores and chop them up to release glucose molecules. And now once we release glucose molecules, we can do glycolysis. And when we do glycolysis, we produce ATP. So that's the way these type 2 skeletal muscles produce ATP. They take their glycogen stores, chop them up, releasing glucose molecules, doing glycolysis to produce ATP. And the neat thing about these type 2 skeletal muscles is they have a ton of glycogen stores. So we can chop up all these glycogen stores all at once, releasing a ton of glucose molecules. So these type 2 skeletal muscles have very quick access to a ton of glucose molecules. And now that they have access to a ton of glucose molecules, they can do a ton of glycolysis to very quickly produce a ton of ATP. These type 2 skeletal muscles have a high capacity for glycolysis due to high upregulation of glycolytic enzymes. So now they have very quick access to ATP. So that's the benefit of these type 2 skeletal muscles. For example, these type 1 skeletal muscles, they need to do the Krebs cycle to create reduced cofactors, to fuel the electron transfer chain, to fuel the electron transfer chain to create this hydrogen ion gradient, to fuel ATP synthase to create the ATP. So we see that's a very slow process and it takes a long time to create ATP. However, these type 2 skeletal muscles, all they have to do is release glucose, do glycolysis, and produce ATP. So therefore, they have very quick access to a ton of ATP. Again, they have quick access to a ton of glucose and then can do a ton of glycolysis to produce a ton of ATP. So these type 2 skeletal muscles can do very quick and explosive contractions because they have very quick access to a ton of ATP. So they can do very powerful, explosive contractions. And not just that, these type 2 skeletal muscles also have phosphocreatine. And this phosphocreatine is a source of phosphate groups. So they can donate phosphate groups to ADP to form ATP. So that's another way these type 2 skeletal muscles can produce a ton of ATP very quickly. So we can see the utility of these type 2 skeletal muscles. Due to all their glycogen, they can chop up all their glycogen at once, releasing a ton of glucose, doing a ton of glycolysis, and producing a ton of ATP. Therefore, very quickly getting quick access to a ton of ATP, and therefore can do very quick, fast, explosive contractions. However, we know if we keep on doing glycolysis, we're going to have to do some fermentation because we know lactic acid fermentation creates the oxidized cofactors that allows glycolysis to continue. So therefore, yeah, these type 2 skeletal muscles can do a ton of glycolysis to produce a ton of ATP very quickly. However, they'll also eventually produce lactic acid, which creates acid and hydronium, which leads to pain and fatigue. And not just that, these hydronium and this acid inhibits actin and myosin contraction. So again, even though these type 2 skeletal muscles can produce very quick access to a ton of ATP, they can only do this for a short period of time. Because very quickly, only in the matter of a couple seconds, will they produce enough lactic acid that produce enough acidic conditions to lead to pain. But now we can see the difference between type 2 and type 1 skeletal muscle. We see type 1 skeletal muscle is optimized to do oxidative phosphorylation. And the utility and the benefit of this type 1 skeletal muscle is they can do this oxidative phosphorylation all day long. As long as they have access to oxygen and their mitochondria, they can do this oxidative phosphorylation to produce ATP and contractions all day long. However, these type 2 skeletal muscles, the utility of these type 2 skeletal muscles is due to the glycogen and upregulation of glycolytic enzymes. They have very quick access to a ton of glucose and therefore can do a ton of glycolysis to produce a ton of ATP very quickly. So they can do very quick, explosive contractions. However, they can only do these contractions for a short period of time until they feel fatigued. So again, that's the big picture difference between type 1 and type 2. Type 1 relies on oxidative phosphorylation and can do contractions all day long, while type 2 uses glycolysis, and yeah, they can do explosive quick contractions. They can only do it for short periods of time. So again, this is the difference between type 1 and type 2 skeletal muscle. And now you can see why type 1 is referred to as slow twitch and while type 2 is referred to as fast twitch. Because again, these can very quickly very quickly do very explosive contractions due to quick access of glucose and glycolysis to produce a ton of ATP. And why these are called slow twitch, because again, that process to create the ATP for contraction occurs very slowly. However, we can do this all day long. This is sustainable. This doesn't get us fatigued. So we can see there's a benefit of having both slow twitch type 1 muscle fibers and fast twitch type 2 muscle fibers. Remember, these type 2 fast twitch muscle fibers can do very quick, explosive contractions. However, they can only do these contractions for short periods of time until they produce enough lactic acid that leads to fatigue. However, these type 1 skeletal muscle, they can do relatively weaker contractions. However, they can do these contractions all day long. Due to oxidative phosphorylation and a lot of access to oxygen and mitochondria, they can do oxidative phosphorylation all day long without getting as fatigued. So there's a utility to having both type 1 and type 2 skeletal muscles to create an optimized person. And the truth is, if you were to analyze any muscle, for example, if we were to take a cross-section of this particular muscle, we would see a combination of both type 1 and type 2 skeletal muscles. And in reality, just like everything else in biology, it's much more complex, and there's type 2A and type 2B, and there is even more further subdivisions. So it's a little more complicated than that. But the general point of this video are there's two types of skeletal muscle, type 1, type 2. Type 1 is optimized for oxidative phosphorylation. Type 2 is optimized for glycolysis and quick explosive control.